directly or indirectly promoting racism and discrimination. Beyond that, we want to promote change. So we want people participating to, have a fire in them to make their communities better, to make them not just themselves better, but their communities better. And then beyond that, we want to also provide action steps. So we want everyone participating to leave with some guidance on actual things that they can do to create change in those communities. So thank you guys again for joining us. And now I'm going to pass it to Dr. Lamisha Brown.
Good morning to our attendees and good afternoon to the panelists. My name is Dr. Lamisha Brown and I use she, her, hers pronouns. Currently, I am the Director of Student Success and Academic Advising at the University of Minnesota Crookston, where I lead our Student Success Center. Under my purview includes academic advising, academic support services, career services, first year experience, multicultural education, and student success initiatives. I earned my PhD in education and a graduate certificate in diversity, equity, and inclusion at the University of Georgia. My research revolves around Black women's experiences in higher education, first-generation doctoral students, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm also one of the co-founders of #FirstGenDocs, a digital space intervention that provides community uplift and affirmation for first-generation doctoral students. I'm so excited to welcome you all to our first conversation in our two-part series. Today, we will focus on the Black Lives Matter movement with a historical look at racism and its impact. However, before we start, I want to introduce today's panelists. First, we have Dr. Raven Coakley, she, her, hers. She is a recent graduate of the Counselor Education and Supervision doctoral program at the University of Georgia. Broadly, her research agenda explores experiences of Black students in P through 20 and community settings, with an emphasis on the sociocultural and socio-emotional experiences of Black girls in school. As a school-based mental health counselor, Dr. Coakley specializes in providing culturally affirming group therapy services to underrepresented students, students of color, first generation, and lower income students, etc. In an effort to integrate her scholarship and advocacy efforts, Dr. Coakley established Counselors for Black Lives, a resistance movement committed to affirming the dignity and humanity of Black life. She is also a proud co-founder of #FirstGenDocs, a digital counterspace movement serving over 6,500 first-generation doctoral scholars across the globe. Dr. Coakley is also a 2018 NBCC Minority Doctoral Fellow. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Coakley. Next, we have Dr. Jason Wallace, he, him, his. He is a higher education researcher and practitioner from Fort Worth, Texas. His research centers on issues of equity and inclusion in higher education, investigating the systemic and institutional forms of oppression which impact students who hold multiple marginalized identities. Specifically, Dr. Wallace's scholarship addresses three major research strands. Number one, equity and justice for Black students and professionals who hold multiple marginalized identities in higher education. Number two, the experiences of first generation students of color at various academic levels. And number three, the use of culturally relevant qualitative research methods in higher education inquiry. Having presented over 30 peer-reviewed conference presentations at international, national, and regional conferences, Dr. Wallace seeks to educate higher education scholars and practitioners about the history of anti-Black racism and discrimination and how it informs our current social unrest and societal context. One of his proudest accomplishments is co-founding FirstGenDocs, a virtual platform that seeks to affirm the experiences, amplify the voices, and celebrate the brilliance of first-generation doctoral students. He received a PhD in education with an emphasis in college student affairs administration and a graduate certificate in interdisciplinary qualitative studies from the Mary Frances Early College of Education at the University of Georgia. Dr. Wallace will serve as a tenure-track assistant professor of higher education at the University of Southern Mississippi, beginning in August 2020. Thank you for being here, Dr. Wallace. Next, we have Dr. Quaisha Williams, she, her, hers. She currently serves as the Assistant Director of First Scholars Initiatives with the Center for First Generation Student Success. She is a proud first-generation college graduate with over 10 years of higher education experience in college access, academic program development, and equity education. Dr. Williams recently completed her PhD in College Student Affairs Administration at the University of Georgia, where her dissertation research focused on the impact of social movements and cultural climate on the parenting and professional practices of Black mothers. She also holds a Master of Science in Higher Education Administration and a Bachelor of Science in Family and Child Sciences, both from Florida State University. Thank you for being here today, Dr. Williams. So to each of the panelists, thank you for being here, and to the attendees, if you have any questions, of course, you can use the Q&A function that is down below. So feel free to use that throughout. We will have time for question and answer at the end of the session. For our session today, we do have a lot to cover, and in order for us to get to where we are right now and the significance of what we are seeing in the Black Lives Matter movement, we need to talk about the history of racism and discrimination towards Black people. So to start us off, we have our first question. To our panelists, how do you define racism, and why does addressing racism matter? Dr. Coakley, would you like to start us off?
I was going to let Dr. Wallace start us off.
Sure. Thank you all again for having us. We're super excited to be here, and I'm super excited to see our fellow panelists who I haven't seen since pre-COVID. So it's excited to see you all virtually. I'll start with kind of the technical definition that I mostly enjoy, and it's by scholar Patricia Bedall from the 1970s, and she really talks about how racism is power plus prejudice. And so those two things have to be present for racism to exist. And so what does that mean? Power is not just, what you have in the moment, but what is systemically entrenched into the world, into our laws, into the ways that we kind of move around the world, things of that nature. And so I think about this as I try to explain it to my younger sister. My younger sister is 20, and I tried to explain this to her a few months ago around like, what does racism actually look like? And when I think about power, especially at the age of 20, she's staying at home with our mother, and it's the thing that she lives in every day, right? So our parents, our legal guardians, they have the power in the home, which means they hold the money, they feed us, they make the rules, they do everything to kind of control our lives while we're living under their roof, as my mother would say often, and reminds me often, right? And so that is the power that they hold in that space. They also have legal power. So there are actually court documents where you are not legally able to do certain things without parental consent until you turn 18. So it is not only just power that's happening inside of the home, it's power that's happening outside of the home legally as well. And so you couple that with prejudice, this kind of amorphous thing of not liking someone for no really good reason, right? Not respecting someone for no really good reason, outside of the fact of one very specific thing. And so to bring it back to that example, if my mother just decided she doesn't like how my sister speaks, she doesn't like her pitch is too high, right? If she just didn't like that, coupled with the power that she holds, she can decide that I'm going to give your sister less allowance money than I gave you. I'm going to make your sister sleep on an air mattress and you can sleep in the bed. I'm not going to feed your sister as many times as I feed you. And so she not only has that power, but she holds this prejudice that then impacts how she sees the world, how she operates in the house, how she lives her life, right? And so that's kind of what's happening, or is what's happening outside of the world, right? There are, in America, white people hold the power, right? So they were the founders of America, and they put into place all these systems to make them the most powerful folks in America at the time, and that has been led down to here we are in 2020, that power still exists. Plus the prejudice that a lot of people hold, namely white folks hold for people of color, that they just do not enjoy people of color for whatever reason because of their skin tones, right? And so you couple that power with the prejudice, and then that's how racism is born. And I really appreciate that definition because it really takes into account both of those factors. Because I can be prejudiced towards someone, I cannot like someone. I can say, I don't like my sister because her voice is too high, but I don't control anything in the home. So it doesn't matter that I don't like it because the prejudice that I hold, I don't have any power to couple with that. Or you can have power and not hold the prejudice, right? And then you can work to make everyone equal, right? So if you hold this power, you can say, hey, we should all be eating the same thing at the dinner table. So I'm going to feed you both equally. Both of our parents, they hold the power. They decide to feed ourselves and our siblings equally because they like us both. They love us both equally, right? But when you have the power plus the prejudice, that's when it gets really tricky because then you have this thing called racism that's deeply entrenched into our society. And so that's how I try to wrap my mind around racism and what that looks like.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wallace. So for either of the other panelists, why is it important for us to address racism?
I can go. Y'all see why I wanted him to start? That was perfect. So when you're thinking about why addressing racism matters, my very practical response to that is because Black folks are dying every day, literally, right? Well, literally and figuratively, which I think we'll talk about too, how it kind of shows up in our educational and higher education spaces. And so when thinking about, this very practical response of why addressing racism matters, it matters because Trayvon Martin should still be alive. Michael Brown should still be alive. Sandra Bland and Breonna Taylor and Kareem, all of these people should still be alive. And they're not because of white supremacy and racism, and specifically anti-Black racism in this country. And so we have to have some very intentional conversations around that. We have to reckon with that first as people who live on this stolen land, right? And then we have to have some more intentional conversations around what we can do about it.
I just also want to add something to that. Beautifully spoken, Dr. Coakley. But I feel like I've had new conversations around this because, I have a parent. So I've been having to have these conversations on like a smaller level, or I live in a predominantly white neighborhood. So I've been having to have these conversations with my white neighbors who are now trying to reason with, how do I talk to my kids about this? And so the why part for me is that if we don't talk about it, if we don't address it, it just continues to be perpetuated, right? And so within the Black community, I feel like there's this thing called the talk, where, and also when I feel like I will say also in other communities of color, but there's this talk about how you might be discriminated against or XYZ because you don't do this. And so all of these like do's and don'ts that a lot of Black parents have with their children. And I was having a really good conversation about how we also need those dialogues and discussions not to be just in the Black community, because we don't, as Dr. Wallace said, we don't hold that power. They also need to be had somewhere else in those white homes about, okay, what is it that discrimination is? How could you have underlying bias that isn't the same thing as burning crosses and saying the N-word? What are the other ways that we kind of perpetuate this? And so I think that's really why we have to, because if not, it's something that stays in certain communities about like, try not to go places at night, don't have your hoodie up, don't do all these things. But the people who often inflict the harm aren't having these conversations. So it's just business as usual. So.
Thank you for that. That brings up a thought that I have just around this idea of, Black people in America just want to live. And so we do have to have all of these types of conversations within our families and with our children's. Whereas if we had white communities who were having these types of conversations, it would be this don't fear a Black person who looks a certain way or has their hoodie up, for example, versus the only conversation being that we have to tell our kids not to have their hoodies up. And so, this idea and this phenomenon, right, that we experience as racism, it's not new. This is something that has been centuries, right, in the making. And so even going back to slavery, and it leads to my next question, many people tell Black folks to just get over slavery. But why is a statement like get over it an issue? Why does racism, or how does racism influence the world that we live in today?
So I'll tackle some of that. One of the things that's always for me so striking, and I thought about it, I went home to visit my mother, and my grandmother gets all of these little notepads and like return labels because she donates to all of these different random nonprofits. So she has this notepad and it says, never forget, and it has an American flag on it. And so I was like, okay. And so never forget, I feel like most people off bat, never forget is talking about 9/11. And so in America, there's this, we should never forget 9/11, right? We should never forget the terrible thing that happened to us that forever changed the way we travel, forever changed our society, correct? We have the Holocaust, we have all of these things that happen, but yet slavery is the thing that is focused about, it should like, it happened a long time ago, or you should forget it. Like there are the same way there are implications that we still see today from 9/11, increased security, all of these things, there are still implications that we see from slavery today. And so I just always think that's really interesting that that's the thing that people should get over. And it influences so many of the things that we see today, because when racism was not something that was illegal, or when systems didn't have to be open for all, they were created, right? And so did we change the systems, or did we just let people come into them? So instead of saying we had public education, instead of saying, okay, let's create a new system that is going to make sure we have equity, all of these different things for all of these people we're now educating, we just opened the doors and told people everybody has to go to these schools. And so the systems didn't change. So if the systems were built with inherent racist practices, philosophies, XYZ, that doesn't change just because you let other people in. So that's before I go on my soapbox.
I'll just, retweet all that Dr. Williams said. And I'll just give a personal example of like how I experienced racism in 2020. And so historically, the police were created to specifically capture black folks, and to really to keep poor folks out of elite neighborhoods. And so it was not only for specifically black folks, but also poor white folks, to keep them in line and away from the white elite of America. That was the purposes of police. You fast forward decades later, right? And we still see some of those inequities that are still couched within this system, as Dr. Williams was saying, because the system hasn't necessarily changed. Are there black police? Absolutely. There's tons of black police now, and they're still operating under the system that was created decades ago, right? And so as a black man, I've been pulled over by the police over 4 times, right? I can remember each one of them vividly. The top 3 times that I do remember, and it wasn't because like I was speeding or because my tail light was out or any of those things. It was just I've been pulled over. One time, a friend of mine was pulled over and I was pulled out of the back seat of the car because I fit the description of someone who had robbed a place around the corner. When I then later saw the person, the person was Black, but he looked nothing like me. He had hair, I didn't at the time. We were probably about the same height. He was much lighter skinned than I was. But I was pulled out of the back of a car. This is while I was in college, right? And searched and treated as if I were a criminal when I hadn't, right? So as a result of that, how racism shows up for me now is that I am often afraid when I see police officers, even though I'm not breaking any crimes. Like we should not be afraid. If you're not a criminal, you shouldn't be afraid of the police, right? There's no reason to be afraid of them because they are supposed to protect and serve us, right? However, I've had so many instances where I've been frisked, I've been pulled aside, I've been, interrogated about things that I had nothing to do with, simply because I am a Black person in America, right? And the system was created to police Black people and poor people in America. And so I think we have to Dr. Williams' point, we have to think about what are some of those systems that are still impacting folks right now, because we haven't said, let's disrupt all of this and restart and figure out the best way to make sure that we're all safe, to make sure that we are all able to live protected, but also in this free America.
What you just said, Dr. Wallace, honestly connects right into the next question that we have, because if we're talking about slavery, right, and people will bring up the fact that, well, slavery was abolished, there really are no issues, Black people have equal rights, but we know that while slavery in the way that it was may have been abolished, it has continued on in other forms. It really hasn't ended. So I'd love to hear from either of you on what do you think about this, the idea that even though slavery was abolished, it never ended? And are there other real life experiences that either of you can share that support this from your experience?
I'll jump in here for that first part, right? So thinking about how I think Dr. Bettina Love describes this perfectly. Slavery never ended. It just sort of transitioned a little bit, right? And so we think about sort of chattel slavery and when Black folks who were enslaved were forcefully brought to this country, right? And so we think about some time after that, we move into Jim Crow and now this prison industrial complex, like it has a new face. And white supremacists in some places aren't necessarily wearing hoods anymore. Now they're wearing business suits. Now they are our attorneys and our governors. Hello, shout out to Georgia. They're the people who occupy the White House currently. Like they're everywhere, right? It looks a little different. Like Dr. Williams was saying at the beginning, folks aren't necessarily burning crosses anymore. Now they're murdering Black folks who are walking down the street wearing a hoodie and carrying a can of sweet tea and a bag of Skittles, right? But the impact of it is still the same. The detriment of losing Black folks is still felt widely. It's still present. It's still what we live every single day. It hasn't gone away. It just looks a little differently. And depending on who you speak to, like, some elders in Black communities will tell you, well, this is the life that we were born into, right? It doesn't necessarily look differently to them. We don't necessarily expect anything different from white folks in this country because this is what we know. So I'll stop there before I get on my soapbox.
Any other thoughts from either of the other two panelists? All right, so moving on to the next question. Many people believe that racism looks a certain way. For example, saying racial slurs. And if we don't use those words, then we can't be racist. What do you think people believe, or sorry, why do you think people believe this or feel this way? And how can we address this in a more truthful way?
I'll start with that one. I think a lot of people believe that or feel that way because that's the way that racism is taught about in schools. So it's like, a long time ago, there were these people, they were bad people, they did these bad things. And then Martin Luther King came and spoke nonviolence. And then Martin Luther King was murdered, people were upset, they marched, and then all the races they was gone. And racism was over. And we integrated schools and we've been doing great ever since. And so I think that's the way that racism is phrased. And so racist is this picture in a history book of people wearing Ku Klux Klan robes, burning crosses, hanging, like that's what a racist is. So anything outside of that isn't a racist, right? Your grandpa who calls people that, like your grandpa who doesn't like you playing with Black kids, or all of those things aren't racist. That's just preferences, or that's just, in response to crime, or there are all these different pretty language to put on things that, so again, the Ku Klux Klan, that's what racism is, and that's what a racist is. And so I think it's hard for people to understand that because that's what their connotation is. And I think even going back to how we talked about before, we have to move beyond that. We have to think about in what ways are our systems and our structures implicitly biased, implicitly racist. And also in what ways are we, this system was created. And when I say we, Black people are also affected by racism. Black people can internalize anti-Black racism. That's the reason why so many Black women and Black girls have very, very interesting, complex relationships with their hair. And so there are all of these ways that it's in the air. So I use that as a metaphor for someone recently. I'm like, racism is in the air, right? And so for me, it's not about, are you a racist or aren't you a racist? It's what have you done to be anti-racist, or what have you done to be not a racist? Because if it's in the water, you're gonna have it in you some kind of way. Maybe you're not burning crosses, maybe you got Black friends, maybe you let your daughter date a Black man, whatever, Black woman, whoever, but it's still it's inherent within our country, so it has to be in you somewhere. And even in Black people.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Williams. What you're saying to me is this idea that people only see racism or racist acts when it's on an individual level. So I, as an individual, like you said, I have friends who are Black. I, talk to Black people. I work with Black people. I'm in school with Black people. Everything is good. I never say anything that's racist. And like you said, there isn't this understanding of the greater systems that are at play. And so let's say, for example, you are a student and you are having to choose who you want to be your next president, student body president, right? You might have two candidates and both of them are really great. However, probably 9 times out of 10, it would be the white student who would win because the white student is who people will vote for. And so there's a lack of understanding how even in a situation like that, racism shows up, right? Because the Black student who was extremely qualified, maybe even more so qualified for some reason, and it's because they're Black, you don't see them as a qualified president for your student body. Any other thoughts on that question around people not really understanding what racism is if it's not included with a racial slur. Awesome. All right, so moving on to the next one, we are now going to get into conversations more so about the Black Lives Matter movement. So what is the Black Lives Matter movement and how did the movement begin?
I'll start here. So the movement for Black Lives, or Black Lives Matter movement, more specifically, really began as a love letter to Black folks. 3 Black queer women created this hashtag Black Lives Matter in response to the failure to indict Trayvon Martin's murderer here in Sanford, Florida, or in Florida. And they were saying, you know, Black folks, we love you, we see you, your life matters, Black Lives Matter, and put a hashtag on it. And then the world stopped, or so it seems. And so we've been able to sort of galvanize folks from various spheres of influence, our educators and folks who work in the criminal justice system, and people from all walks of life, students, professors, folks who believe that, like they believe that Black Lives Matter. And so essentially the movement it's affirming the dignity and humanity of Black life with three simple words, right? Black Lives Matter. We are in protest of Black folks dying, or people dying, really, at the hands of the police, and criminal justice issues where Black folks are disproportionately sentenced in our criminal injustice system, Black women's health and maternal wealth. It's like, it's all encompassing, right? Because Black folks are not one-dimensional people. That's sort of what the movement has grown to be. But at the core, when you're really just first starting to understand it, it's really about affirming Black life. Like, you deserve to live because you are a Black person, right? Like, you are not less valued as a human. Folks should not just be able to kill us just because we're Black. Like, that's essentially what we're talking about. And so I forgot the second part of your question, but that's how it began in response to the failure to indict the murderer of Trayvon Martin. And since then, we've used it to sort of call attention to the disproportionate rates of Black folks dying at the hands of police and other white vigilantes, honestly, and being able to call for some sense of accountability, because it's the statistics, say that only 1% of police-involved shootings result in a conviction. And so you think there's a 99% chance that we will never have justice as we know it now. We can think about sort of this abolitionist future where we don't have a policing system. What might that look like? But in the world that we currently live in, there's a 99% chance that folks who murder Black folks will never serve any time, will never have any justice. So that's where it came from.
Thank you so much for providing that overview for us, Dr. Coakley. So moving in to our next question, there have been a lot of protests in the news recently in response to the murders of Black folks, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Tony McDade, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others, at the hands of the police and white supremacists. Why do you think people have chosen to protest at this time? What exactly are they protesting against, and what are they asking for?
Well, I'll hop in here. I have a lot of thoughts around around that question. That's a heavy question. One, we're in a very difficult time. No matter who you are as a human on this planet, we are in a very difficult time in the midst of a global pandemic. And so I hope folks are doing their best to stay safe and wear a mask wherever they are. And coupled with this global pandemic, it has brought a huge economic downturn that has left many people unemployed. And so that is another big thing that's happening in the world right now, in America right now, is this huge unemployment. You have folks quarantining, folks are sick, people are dying, there are folks who are losing jobs. And so it's all of this is happening, right? Also, we now know that this disease, this pandemic, is disproportionately killing more Black and brown folks. And so because of, back to the systems that Dr. Williams was speaking of earlier, of healthcare systems, of folks not believing Black folks when they're saying that they're sick, they're hurting, they're in pain, right? All of those reasons, Black folks are dying disproportionately more than white folks who are also experiencing the exact same pandemic, right? That doesn't make any sense, right? And so you have all of that. And then George Floyd is then murdered by a white police officer who it's obvious from video footage that almost intentionally took his life, right? And so it's not that people are protesting now because I argue people probably are protesting every day, but definitely Black folks have been protesting for a while, right? And it's just not getting the media coverage is not in a major city. The protests aren't as large as we see them now. We're not seeing them in every city like we're seeing them now, but it's not going over countries, but protests are happening all the time. People are being murdered. Black people are being murdered all the time at the hands of law enforcement. And so we're seeing that. But this perfect storm of folks are already mad because family members are dying, friends are dying, right? There's this perfect storm because folks don't have employment. There's this perfect storm because Black and brown folks know that there is a higher chance that we will die from this thing called COVID-19 than our white counterparts and folks who are poor, right? And so thinking about those things, it has become this perfect storm of we are exhausted and we have time because guess what? We're in the middle of a global pandemic. And so this process is going to be bigger than it's ever been, right? And so it's interesting because those of us who study this, those of us who are activists, those of us who are on the front lines, like we've been seeing these protests happen all the time. Like this isn't new for many of us. I'd argue many of us on the call, I would guess this is not new for us, but there is a new energy thanks to all of this perfect storm that's happening over here, right? So I think that is why you're seeing it. I think the media has finally decided to give a voice to these causes, right? Because it's been happening again for decades. Folks have been marching for decades. Folks have been crying for decades, right? And now the media is saying like, hey, we should probably listen. Now businesses are saying, hey, Black lives do matter, right? I remember, as Dr. Cobley said, when Black Lives Matter was termed, it immediately became controversial, and many companies would not sign on it. No one would say it, and for whatever reason, folks just felt like it was a political cry. And now you see, like Amazon is releasing a Black Lives Matter statement, right? And so it's just an interesting turn of events. That has now made this public, that makes space for these conversations. And so I think lots of folks feel good about the fact that this conversation has become mainstream. And what we are hoping for is that it doesn't just become a news story and then stops, but that there are actual change that comes after this. If it's going to be mainstream, let there be change that comes with it. And so yeah, all that to say, that's probably why people are now noticing the protests more than they have in the past.
I'll just add on to kind of the latter part of the question, but yes, retweet to Dr. Wallace that the protests aren't new. So these are things that protests have been happening for a long time. Organizations, activists, people have been organizing and fighting against this for a long time. And so just kind of to answer some of the part about, I think it was like, what are protesters asking for? And so I think there's a variety of things that protesters are asking for, and even within one protest, there's a variety of different things that different people want. I feel like immediate for a lot of folks at the protest is for justice, right? Indictments, some sort of repercussions for the murder of insert name, unfortunately. Most commonly, I feel like, and most common in the media, by hands of police. But it could not just be a police issue. And so I feel like a lot of times that's a lot of the focus, police killings. And yes, that is. And there are also other killings at the hands of white, I think someone mentioned vigilantes or just, yeah, let me get on that. I also think people are calling for systemic restructure. So I've seen a lot of things about defunding the police. And so while that is like a whole other extra thing in itself, and even when I saw it, I was like, what does defunding the police? I'm like, okay, what does that mean? And so I feel like that defunding the police and systemic restructuring gets to kind of what we talked about earlier with the way systems were created a certain way and how we have to have a critical look about how are the ways that our systems are implicitly perpetuating racism or racist practices. And so I think there are a lot of people who are calling for that. And I think there are a lot of people who are just calling for attention to something that has been plaguing communities for a long time. And they're just tired, they're sad, they're mad, they're angry, all of these things. And so those are just like a few that come off the top of my head, but I feel like there are so many different things that people want, right?
Yeah, thank you for that. Something that you said, Dr. Wallace, that stood out to me and helps to lead into this next question is how, we do have a lot of businesses and organizations and folks who are now saying Black lives actually do matter, and that they are taking a stand against that and creating messages to send out to the folks who, engage with them. However, there are other folks who respond to a phrase like Black Lives Matter with phrases like all lives matter or blue lives matter. What is the issue with these type of responses? And how would you respond to someone using one of these phrases in order to invite them into a conversation about social justice?
I'm gonna do my best here. So first, there are no blue people, okay? So there are no blue lives. We'll start right there at the very basic level here, okay? And that, just to clarify, folks say blue lives matter in support of the police or law enforcement in this country. And so what I've seen people say before in response to that in particular is, one, what I just said, there are no blue lives, and you get to take your blue uniform off at the end of the day. I never come out of my skin. I don't want to, but just to illustrate, right? I don't get to take this off in the experiences that come with this identity. I never get to take that off. You get to come out of your uniform at some point during the day. And in terms of the all lives matter piece, okay. But in saying that you also agree with me, because I'm included in the all, am I not? As a Black person, my Black life also has to matter. And so an illustration that I tend to give folks, I do a lot of my work in secondary settings in middle school and high school. And so I say, well, what if your house caught on fire, right? And we're calling the fire department to come in response to you needing help. And the fire department says, well, we're not gonna give you any water. We're just gonna spray water on everybody else's house. Because all houses matter, right? But all houses aren't on fire. My house is on fire right now. I need help right now. Black lives matter. We need help right now, today. It's not saying that we matter more or we're the only people who matter. It's saying we matter too, essentially. And our house is on fire. We need water right now, today. And there's enough water to go around for everybody. So if your house catches on fire tomorrow, then we can do that. But right now, in this moment, I need help. And that's sort of where I try to begin the conversation. If folks can conceptualize that piece, then there's some room for us to do some good work. If not, then, you kind of have to choose your battles and let folks come to it whenever they hopefully do come to it. But yeah, that's it.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think you, answered that beautifully and talked about this idea of the house, right? And comparing that to a Black life. You most certainly would not go and spray water on the home that is not burning. So it is important for us to focus in on what the issue is at the moment. Any response to how you would respond. I know you shared it, but from either of the other panelists on how you would respond to someone who says Black Lives Matter, or sorry, Blue Lives Matter or All Lives Matter?
For me, I feel like I often use some sort of analogy similar to Dr. Coakley. I think another piece that came up in discussion was, so if you say, if there's a Blue Lives Matter, right, debate. And so for me, then the problem wasn't that a particular group, like, so you're saying Blue Lives Matter, that means you're talking about law enforcement matter, right? People who are in law enforcement matter. And so if you can understand that you feel as though that set group is being attacked or XYZ, so you are saying their life matters, you are in turn doing the same thing as Black Lives Matter. So if you say Blue Lives Matter in response to Black Lives Matter, then the word that bothered you was Black. You could understand that, okay, it's not that these people matter any less, it's that right now I feel like these people need our help. And so I'm going to support them. And so sometimes that works, oftentimes not. But I feel like that sort of reasoning is, you're doing the same, like we're doing the same thing. You know, we're just responding to it differently. And how do we come together to have the conversation so that you can, you know, that both parties can kind of see where each other is coming from.
Thank you. So I'm looking at the Q&A, and there's a question that came up that I wanted to pose to the group. It says, this issue keeps coming up for decades, but it doesn't seem to get resolved. This time, though, it feels like a more diverse population is getting into the conversation. It looks like it is different this time, but do you think there's something different? What key indicators would you like to see which would verify that this time is in fact different?
Thank you for the question. That it does feel different to me. I think there is a renewed energy, a new energy around Black Lives Matter, and you're seeing more diverse communities out in the protests. I think, particularly, I think back to after Trayvon was murdered and his murderer was acquitted. I think about the protests that I saw in the media, the protests I were involved in, were mostly people that look like me, right? And so to look on the news and to see like, oh wow, it's really diverse out there, you know, to not be able to pinpoint that it's all Black folks that's marching for Black lives, that's really encouraging and exciting. And so the energy is different. I think the key indicators for me would be to see some more of those systemic changes, right? So I am appreciative of the symbolic stuff. I think we need to have the both and. And so I love that in terms of Indigenous folks, that these teams are like saying, we're revisiting the mascots. We're getting rid of these mascots. We're, you know, like, that's great. Do it. You know, like, cause that's something that needs to be done. And I want to see an acknowledgement from the National Football League. I want to see acknowledgement from the National Basketball Association that says these are the ways that we're changing things systemically, so that our owners aren't all white and our players aren't all Black. So that if a player decides that he wants to stand up and protest in a very peaceful way for Black lives in this country, as Colin Kaepernick did, that will not only be supported, but we will not fire, systemically get him out of the league as a result of that. So I want to see some of those pieces, some of the more systemic, the policy pieces. I think those will be the key indicators of like, okay, we're making strides, we're moving forward. Again, the symbolic piece is great, do the thing, right? And it will eventually mean nothing without those deep policy pieces, those deep systemic pieces that really make sure that Black folks, that brown folks are equal in society, and really having this equitable piece that we're missing right now. So that's going to be some of the key indicators for me.
Yeah, thank you so much for answering that. There's another question that came in that I wanted to pose to the group. So someone asked, do people prefer to be called Black or African American? And could you explain your answer? We want to be sure we are using proper language when having conversations and advocating for Black Lives Matter in our community.
Go, Dr. Williams.
I was just gonna say that honestly, I think the key word in like that question is prefer. So it's a preference. So there are some people who prefer to be identified as Black. There are some people who prefer, and so I think that's difficult because again, it's not, there isn't just one term that like Black people or or African American. I tend to use the term Black personally. I visited Ghana on the continent of Africa, and I just always felt like the term African American in itself was a big, to be African without memory and American without, what's the saying? To be American without rights or something. I don't know. So the term African American for me has always been like a difficult term to be or feel, because not feeling quite African, not feeling quite American, but I do feel Black. But again, I think that would be, in wanting to know that, I think you ask whoever it is, maybe you are in conversation with or in community with, what they prefer, or they might not care. And so again, it's really a preference thing.
I'll just add one thing to what Dr. Williams said, retweet. Not all Black folks are African American. So in this country, or on this stolen land, I should say, not all Black folks here identify as African American. They're people, Black folks from every part of the world, because Black people exist everywhere, believe it or not, who also live here. And so it's to just kind of look at someone that you encounter in this country and label them as African American when they may not identify that way is also problematic. So I just wanted to add that piece.
Thank you, Dr. Williams and Dr. Coakley. That's exactly what I was thinking. And if you hadn't said it, I was going to add that part about Black versus African American. There is another question that came through, and I know we are running low on time. So I do want to ask, or say, the Declaration of Independence was just words. It never actually happened. This is a statement that someone said, and they said, why?
Well, yes, you're right. love that statement. I will say that it did happen for some people. It happened for white people, right? Like, so they, I'm fresh off of watching Hamilton on Disney Plus. And so, for those of you who have seen Hamilton, it did happen for white people at that time, white elite folks at that time, rich folks at that time, when the independence was when it was time and they were independent from Britain. Like, those folks were essentially free to build their own government, to make their own rules and currency and all those things, right? Unfortunately, Black folks were still enslaved when all that stuff was happening. And so, to your point, to your statement, yeah, the Declaration of Independence was just words for Black folks. It was just words for Native folks who were already on this land and had been murdered and moved around off of the land, right? And so, unfortunately, that wasn't the truth. I think what we're seeing now is in the Black Lives Matter movement is folks trying to get to that. We're still trying to like make that document be true. We're trying to make the songs that we sing be true for every person who is an American citizen, and even for those folks who are not documented American citizens but find themselves in our country, right? So yeah, I think that's a great statement, but it's on both ends.
Thank you for that. Another question that has come through, well, a couple more. So, are you concerned that some parts of the movement, i.e. Defund Police, may be misunderstood and alienate supporters? Or do you think that having these discussions are valuable regardless?
I think they're valuable regardless. They're often misunderstood if you don't try to understand. Like I mentioned earlier, the first time I saw Defund the Police, I was like, oh, wait, what does that mean? And all I did was Google Defund the Police, and in 2 minutes I got it. And so while I was like, that's not something I came up with, I could understand because I was looking to understand what it meant beyond the like short characters, beyond the hashtag. And so I think a lot of people, we get hung up on words and we don't look, even Black Lives Matter in general as a title, then people are hung up on the Black part. So I think those conversations have to happen because I feel like we get so distracted by the Aunt Jemimas and, all of these other physical things when people are talking about systems, people are talking about people's lives. And so I think we have to stop being so easily distracted to really look at what it is beyond just the 3 words that we might see that come across the timeline.
Thank you for that. So another question, how do you think that young children our age can make a bigger difference during these times? I have been told that starting with being educated on this matter is the first place to start, but what would you say is something we could do every day to make a positive impact?
All right, I'm going to tap into my mental health school counselor vibe here. I love that. I love that question. And I get it often, believe it or not, specifically when I'm doing like group counseling work in schools with young people, most often young people of color. And so what I say to them is that first piece is right? We as educators have to do a better job of showing and teaching and being in truth, right? And so I think it was Dr. Williams at the very beginning was talking about how we kind of learned that, MLK came to save the day and then racism ended. That's not true, right? And so our educators and parents have to do a better job of teaching children the truth, teaching students the truth. And also, as far as what you can do as a student is call your parents and educators in when they don't tell you the truth. And I recognize there's some risk there, and we talk about that, right? Like, as Dr. Wallace said at the beginning, your parents hold the power and you want to live there in their home, under their roof, all of that. But there are some conversations that you can have, like, well, Grandpa, like, can you explain to me why you feel that way, right? Or, Mom, I didn't hear it that way in class. Can we talk about that? Or if you have very progressive parents, Dad, I'm having a reaction to what you just said. Can we talk about it? Right? Those are very therapist-y type responses, but they're helpful, or I feel that they're helpful. And some of my students have said that they're helpful to just kind of give you some language to use when you're trying to engage in these conversations. And at the same time, again, as I said before, a lot of that work is on the people with power in the school buildings and in your homes. It's on us to sort of create the space for you to feel safe enough to have those questions. To question and have those conversations.
Yeah, thank you for that. Someone had asked a question about like being an ally or acting in solidarity, but I think what you just said is a great example of how people can be an ally or act in solidarity. It is important that we are learning, right? But then it's also important that we are acting on what it is that we learned. So, being brave to ask questions, being brave to call people into a conversation with you and not just letting what they say slide is so important. And I know that can be very difficult when you are young and it's your teacher or your principal or, your granddad. But I think there are ways to do it that can help them to even think a little bit more critically about what it is that they're saying or what it is that they actually believe about people. And so I know we are actually over time. And so at this point, I do want to thank the panelists so much for sharing your knowledge and experiences related to today's topic. You know, and I thank you all for engaging with them and asking your questions or making your comments. So I know that you all aren't here, but wherever you are, if you can give the panelists a round of applause, even though we can't see you. But thank you all again for being here. Thank you to our attendees. I encourage you to continue to have these conversations at home with your family and with your friends. I also highly encourage you to join me next Saturday, where we'll have 3 new panelists to talk about how to create change. So you can come ready with more of those questions about creating change and what that might look like. So thank you to everyone, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank y'all.
Thank you.